Welcome to our fifth lesson looking at nature and nurture, part of the issues and debates series that we have slowly been working our way through. So if you have missed the last one, it is actually available on YouTube if you want to catch yourself up. Otherwise, feel free to follow along. Okay, so I've got a question, which is why might this child, as you can see pictured, why might he be aggressive? And I want you to write down as many sort of reasons you can think. So if you want, write down the Rotterdam child, and what do you think? Why would such a child be showing displays of such aggression? So you can see the scrunched up face, the hand gesture, the mouth. You can see there's a lot of harshness there in his manner. So why would he be this way? And a lot of people come up to the way he was. Maybe he's taking this from his parents, that he's maybe being influenced by the environment around him. Most people seem to be thinking along these lines, which is the sort of the segue into, well, is there some other things that are at play here? And no, this isn't determinism necessarily, but is it an environmental or an internal or biological force is more so what we're talking about. Okay, so the nature versus nurture topic is, as you can see, you need to understand the relative importance of hereditary and environment and determining behavior and the interactionist approach. So you need to be able to outline the key concepts of nature, nurture, and the interactionist approach. We want to explore some psychological approaches in relation to the nature and nurture debate. So we're going to tie what we have learnt with our psychological understandings, and we're going to pin that to, well, what would Freud say, what would Skinner say, Maslow, etc. And then we want to examine and evaluate the strengths. This is the AO3 content, which I'm going to go over quite a lot. Okay, so before we do, there are some words here which you should have an understanding of all of these. So you should know what hormones are, you should know what testosterone is, what a role model, what it means to be raised, innate genetic reinforcement. I want you to sort of pair them, which word would go with which. So would the idea of how you were raised, is that a nature thing or is that a nurture thing? I think quite obviously you would know which one that would go to. So I'm going to get you to pause the video here, and then I'll show you the answers. So just, you can do this in your mind if you like. There shouldn't be any issues from that. So I'm going to give you 10 seconds, and then we'll move on. Okay, so here are the answers. Excellent. So you can see nature, hormones, genetic, biological, innate. Innate meaning it comes from within, dispositional meaning that you have a tendency towards something, and testosterone being a hormone. Nurture, on the other hand, has reinforcement, so the idea of, in particular, the behaviorist point of view of positive and negative reinforcement, punishment, reward. Then how someone is raised is nurture. Observational learning, so someone who learns through observation. Role model, copying off a role model. Imitation is copying off someone, and cross-cultural studies is looking at how people have been raised and then how they behave. So it's all about, is it different to a cultural perspective? So the debate of free will and determinism goes back a long way. It concerns itself, and it isn't a psychological debate necessarily, it is a philosophical one more than anything. So it's concerned with the extent to which aspects of behavior are the product of inherited or acquired characteristics. So is it something which you acquire over your life, or is it something that you inherit? John Locke, all the way back in, I think it's the 1500s, sorry, not John Locke, René Descartes, argue that human characteristics and even some aspects of knowledge itself are innate. It comes from within. It is a result of your birth. Whereas John Locke, on the other hand, he's an empiricist, and he argues that your mind is like a blank slate, and they use this term tabula rasa at birth, upon which you can be written, or your experience will write and determine who you are. In fact, I think it was him who said that if you give me, 10 babies of, in good health, he's like, I could produce them to be a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, a scientist. It doesn't matter. So anyway, we'll look at nature to start off with. So nature. Here we go. It is the product of innate biological or genetic factors. So this means that your traits that you have, they're passed down. So that's what inheritance means, is like you inherit wealth from one generation to the next. And Bowlby makes the assertion that children are born into the world already biologically programmed to form an attachment. And this is the survival instinct that they are born with. So, and it suggests that behaviours are therefore primarily naturally selected and then passed on as a result of genetic inheritance. So the evolutionists would argue that those children which had a stronger attachment had a greater chance of survival, and therefore they passed that ability on to their offspring then as well, and their children would inherit those characteristics. And so therefore the cause of attachment is innate biological factors. So we will use the term heritability coefficient. Again, words are hard. So this is used to assess the strength of how heritable something is. So we use the number ranging from 0 to 1.0, which indicates, how strong it is, 1 being that is entirely genetically determined. So the general figure for IQ is, for example, like 0.05. You've got multiple studies which suggest this, and what this means is if you have 0.05 is that it is both genetics and environment that plays a factor in intelligence. Then instead, if we look at nurture, we see that behavior is the product of your environmental influences. And your environment is everything that's outside of your body. So this can be things that are going on, your household, your friends, anything that's going on in the outside world. And attachment can also be explained. So Bowlby might be right about something, but there are some other ways that you can answer this same question. So you could argue that, well, food is an association with the mother. So when you pair these together through many repeated pairings, the mother becomes, what the baby is focused on, and associates the mother as the source of food, and therefore there's an attachment that is evolved through classic, operant conditioning. So the child forms this attachment, and so this is based on, the pleasure result of being fed. So again, nurture. Let's just say the environment. Just talking about the environment itself is extremely broad. Like, it is not something that is so simple, and so we kind of need to break it down a little bit. And Richard Lerner has identified some different levels. So he breaks it down to 2: prenatal and postnatal. So prenatal is what goes on within the womb. So what is going on during pregnancy, because even though you are in, you're not technically in the outside world yet, what your mother does whilst she is pregnant can affect you, and also, funnily enough, affect your children. And we talk about that in epigenetics. Postnatal, though, that's obviously the experiences that you can have when you are outside the womb, namely social influences. So why is it too simplistic just to say something is caused by either nature or nurture? Like, why is it that it can't really be one or the other? And I raise the point, and hopefully you know who this is. And if you don't, you might know who this is. This is all the same person. If you still don't, most of you should know this. And if you still don't know, this is all the same person. And obviously this is Voldemort from the Harry Potter series. you can put up a very interesting argument around, well, from his progression from childhood to who he becomes, the villain, the Dark Lord, he who must not be named. Is this a result of his genetics, or is it a result of environmental factors? And so the reason why I think probably the strongest argument is genetics. Because if you understand the story, you know that he was conceived in an unnatural way. His mother, who fell in love with a man who didn't love her back, she concocted a love potion, and out of this unnatural love comes Voldemort. And many people, and this is not exactly, spelled out for you in the books, but a lot of people sort of have reached the conclusion that one of the reasons why he was maybe the way he was because he was conceived in a way that was unnatural, which led to him lacking certain human qualities, namely love. It's sort of ironic, so to speak, that because his mum used a love potion, the thing which he lacks is love, and that's something which then Dumbledore talks about. So you have that argument, but then you can talk about, well, hang on, let's look at his environment. His father abandoned him, his mother died really young, and he grew up in an orphanage, which are not known for being the most caring environments. And as such, Voldemort learned quickly he needed to sort of fend for himself. So growing up in an orphanage in London, back, I think, when would it have been? I think it was in the 40s or the 30s. Obviously not a good environment to be in. I think it might have been even earlier than that. You could make an argument, well, that probably had a profound effect on his childhood. And then as he learns about his heritage, like who his family was, etc., he becomes very resentful to his father, who was a non-magical being. And as such, that would have then played an influence on who he becomes. So was it biology or was it this? And you can't answer it as either or. It's got to be both. And that is something which a lot of psychologists have have concluded to. There's this relative importance between your hereditary and the environment. So it's not both. I mean, the nature-nurture question is just impossible to answer because a child's life begins as soon as it's born, and perhaps even earlier. So that's when the environmental influence starts. And how can you possibly then try to separate the two? So again, you are so closely intertwined. These things are so closely intertwined, practically and theoretically, that it makes little sense to actually try to separate the two. That's why when people go, "Oh, it's nature or nurture," it's silly. It's really silly. And you've got studies that kind of demonstrate the silliness of it. That you got twin studies, and people go, well, look, if we can use twin studies, that can prove that there's a high genetic link. But the problem is that they've also got a shared upbringing as well, which then taints your data. So, I mean, as such, the focus of the nature-nurture debate has not been the same ever since. Now we don't really talk about is it nature or nurture. We're more likely to focus on what is the contribution of each. So in terms of how much of a genetic influence and how much of an environmental influence is there. So ignore the whole nature versus nurture thing necessarily, because at the end of the day, psychologists tend to use the interactionalist approach, which is that nature and nurture work together and interact with each other to shape human behavior. So part of this is what's known as the diathesis stress model, and hopefully you would have learnt this from schizophrenia. If you haven't yet, you will. Diathesis is this. The diathesis part is your genetic predisposition. So you might have a predisposition towards something, like a neurological abnormality that's there. There's a slight neurotransmitter abnormality there. It's not quite producing something, or it's prone to collapsing very easily. And then if you throw in the stress part, so you have a traumatic event in childhood, negative life events, social relationships, like poor social relationships, so there's some sort of loss there, divorce, lots of getting fired, I don't know, environmental stresses. If you pair that then with the predisposition, it could push it over to then trigger your vulnerability to a particular psychological disorder, and in this case, it could be schizophrenia. Then you have epigenetics. You can see there's a picture here where you have generation 1. You can see there's a woman, she's pregnant, and she is smoking. And a woman who smokes whilst pregnant induces epigenetic changes in 3 generations at once. So you've got her unborn daughter here, and then the daughter's reproductive cells. You can probably just see them there, that little blue circle. So that could affect then generation 2 and generation 3. You can probably see where I'm going with this when I talk about epigenetics then. So this is where aspects of your life leave little marks on your DNA. So you can actually change your genetic code without necessarily making big changes to yourself. And those changes to your genetic code then affects your offspring. So these marks tell our body which genes to ignore and which to use, and in turn may go on and then influence the codes of your children, as well as your children's children, your grandchildren, so to speak. And there is a very interesting study where these researchers used mice to look at this. So I'm going to show you a video looking at what Dice and Ressler have to say. Here we go.
This program is brought to you by Emory University.
How can mice like these help us understand how one generation transfers behavioral traits to its descendants?
We of course can't use humans because it's just too complicated. We can't study multiple generations in humans, and we can't manipulate the process in humans to understand mechanism and causation. Mice provide the perfect model.
In fact, these mice have helped shed new light on the emerging field of epigenetics, which has profound implications on the way we might one day treat the effects of trauma.
It's been shown for over 100 years that we can take a mouse, expose them to a mild stressor, and pair that stressor with a sensory cue so that they will then avoid that sensory cue, whether it's a smell or a sound or a visual cue.
I want you to think, what type of conditioning are we talking about here?
And there is evidence in humans in metabolic cases such as the Dutch hunger winter or the Swedish famine, where there's been profound starvation in a generation, that somehow has changed the metabolic processes in subsequent generations. And that seems to be an epigenetic mechanism. And we were really interested in whether such processes may be going on in our model systems.
Okay, so what he is suggesting is that there were some generations of people that after they experienced massive moments of hunger, that affected their metabolic, their ability to process food, and that carried over to their children, where their children, even though they had not experienced the famine, had also experiencing these changes within the way that they process things.
Now, Emory researchers Kerry Ressler and Brian Dias have shown that an experience linked with a smell can modify the architecture of the nervous systems in later generations. They have published their findings in Nature Neuroscience.
What we found in the study was that conditioning animals or training them to associate a particular smell with this mild foot shock gives us descendant generations that are slightly more sensitive to this smell, and their brain devotes more real estate to processing the smell.
And this is about 50 microns.
To our minds, we needed to figure out how this was actually occurring. And there are two real possibilities. One is biological transmission, which is very similar to cultural transmission and you learning from your parents or your grandparents as to how things are done. And the other possibility was an inheritance of these particular traits.
So they separated mice pups from their biological parents and allowed for them to be raised by unrelated mice that had not been conditioned to avoid a certain smell.
And what we found, shockingly, is that the neuroanatomical changes still persisted. That is, the brain still devoted more real estate to processing that cue that was salient to the ancestral generation.
This study adds to a mounting body of evidence that lifestyle choices and trauma can have profound repercussions beyond one's own life. And one day we might be able to use this knowledge to the advantage of both mice and men.
If we take the adult and train them to no longer be afraid, will it prevent that process from transmitting to the next generation? That might have very important implications for treating at-risk populations.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.
Okay, so quite interesting that like these people were able to, and if you didn't quite understand, I'll sort of summarize that these two researchers were able to give mice these sort of electricity shocks every time they were exposed to a particular smell. I think it was acetophenone, which is used in perfume. So I think that's the only thing. You don't need to know the technical name. They use a smell that's used in perfume, and they pair that with an electrical shock. So as any like decent behaviorists would predict, the mice would then associate that shock with the smell. And if you just simply gave the smell on its own, the mice would exhibit a fear response. Okay, that's nothing new. This is well documented. But what was surprising was how the next generation of mice, having not been exposed to the shock, would also fear that smell. So even though they've never received any shocks, they still fear the smell of the acetophenone, I think. And apparently their grandchildren did as well. And so this is it's quite new, this. I didn't learn about this when I was at university. So I was very surprised to read about this and learn about this. I was like, oh wow, this is new. I was sharing it with my housemates about this. So that is epigenetics. So this all ties in with that interactionalist approach. And lastly, don't ask me to pronounce it, phenylketonuria. So this is the idea, is that one influence can override another. So you can have a predisposition towards something, but it can be overridden through behavioral changes. So phenylketonuria or PKU, is a genetic metabolic disorder that can cause brain damage. Quite interesting. If you just type that in, lots of interesting information about it. If the person doesn't eat particular proteins, though, the disorder doesn't get worse. So it shows that your environment can actually override your genetic predisposition. There are two things at play, and again, just proves that who you become and how you result as a person is based on both nature and nurture. So let's organize these studies. So I've got a bunch of different studies here. I want you to look through them all, and I want you to decide, is it fall under nature, nurture, or the interactionalist approach. I'm going to give you time to just pause the video and sort them out, and then I will show you the answers. Okay, here we go. Okay, so nature, you've got antidepressants such as fluoxetine, which can be used to treat OCD. Now, yes, obviously the OCD using drug therapy it's a biological thing, so that would definitely say it is nature. You are handling, because fluoxetine is what stops the serotonin re-intake. So as a result, you are handling things from a biological level. Then you've got Yara, which is your classical and operant conditioning. Well, that's purely nurture. There's no genetic interest there at play. But then we look at the interactionalist approach, and it has a bunch here. So attachment patterns are often a two-way process, biology and your nurture. Epigenetics, as we just learned, was both. The idea of passive influence, again, is also to do with your interactionalist. We just learned about PKU. The diathesis stress model, again, we just learned was interactionalist. And Maguire et al., the study where it looks at the London taxi drivers' brains. So Puggo wants to know, yes, little Puggo here, he wants to know what psychological approach you think each box supports. So which approach to psychology, so where would the psychodynamic, where would the social learning theory, where would all these different theories fly within these, this kind of spectrum, so to speak. And we will look at this in a bit more. So you don't have to worry about thinking about it too much now. We're going to look at it in a few slides. Okay. Let's start to evaluate these approaches. So I've already kind of talked a bit about how it can't be either or. Let's talk about why. There are some pros and cons to each. So we'll start off with nature. This is your AO3 content, so it is important that you write this stuff down. Is that there is contributions of drug therapies. So there's proof that there is merit to what nature is on about. It is supported by twin studies. Twin studies still, using your MZ, your MZ twins in particular, really shows that you have a lot of evidence there to suggest that, nature does play a huge role. But then your twin studies ignores the effect of shared environments. It's very deterministic. So predetermined to develop behaviors from birth, it ignores free will. We did talk a little bit about why this is a problem, though, because when we talked, like in the previous video where I say that the absence of free will is kind of flies in the face of societal's understanding of how we make choices. There's huge controversy around this, in particular the link between race, genetics, and intelligence. So you can see in the little graph that I have here, this idea of putting, saying Asians and white are more, and then you got Hispanic and then black. It's sort of suggesting that races are, one is more superior than another, and we know that that is the foundation of racism, is the belief that one race is more superior than another. And so this is when you have huge controversies, and if you need to have a look at that, go to page 107 in your pink-haired textbook. This brings us to nurture. So nurture has also the contribution of many, many effective therapies. CBT in particular, when we're looking at treating depression. Behavior shaping is, is also a proven concept as well, and has massive practical application in therapy. But you can argue, though, desirable behaviors are selectively reinforced and undesirable behaviors are punished. So in extreme terms, this could be used or could advocate for a society which has extreme controls and manipulates these citizens using these techniques. I'm sure you can think of a very famous book that looks at this very thing. In fact, I think if you look at Orwell's 1984, this is what I'm referring to, where there is an authoritarian state controlled and it manipulates its audience through all sorts of threats of punishment and positive reinforcement. It's this idea that, there can be it can be what happens if what goes wrong. But then B.F. Skinner did kind of the opposite, where he gave a book called Walden 2, where it looks at a utopian society where human beings are reinforced and shaped towards their potential. But does that mean then that humans, is that fair on humans then? Because isn't part of being human is you can make your own destiny, and the journey is that you make and learn these things for yourself, rather than someone else doing it for you. It seems counterintuitive to what the human process is. Then moving on to the next point is behaviors account in terms of learning, but learning itself has a genetic basis. For example, researchers found that mutant flies, this is a fruit fly, not a fly, missing a crucial gene cannot be conditioned. And I think an example of this is that you can argue, well, kids who have a natural intelligence will shape their own workspace. They will be more likely to create their environment. And so you can't really argue that it's environmental because maybe it's their biology which is informing their environment. And then lastly, it doesn't take into account genes and biological predispositions. So, researching this then. Pago again has a question, which is, what research methods would be useful in investigating whether something is a cause of nature or nurture? So, looking at this then, I want you to think then, well, what are some sort of ways, some sort of approaches we could go about trying to conduct some research for nature or nurture? And I'm going to give you some clues here. So, we start off with family study. So this is conducted through looking at an incident of the same disorders recurring in relatives. So you've got a person who has a particular disorder, and then you want to look at how often does this reoccur in your family. So knowing your family history is extremely important. In fact, it is often a question that might be asked by a doctor when you go in for a particular treatment. Do you have a history of this occurring in your family? Twin studies. So a monozygote twins share 100% of their DNA. That's the premise anyway. A proband, and the proband is someone who has the disorder, and their twin are studied. Usually results in a correlation coefficient, that number between 0 and 1.0, or a percentage risk. We have adoptive family studies. This can be used to prove a genetic link or a cause in the environment. And then you have your cross-cultural studies where we look at the traits and behaviors across different cultures to determine if they are innate or a product of the environment. But they do have their limitations. So for nature, it's not a weakness of the method, but it's important for evaluation in the wider debate that the results of these studies never really show a complete genetic influence. At the end of the day, because the environment's there, you can never 100% say, oh yes, this is genetics. Then when it comes to nurture, you have a sort of form of confirmation bias where are you just seeing what you want to see? Like, you can kind of make up a lot of stuff as you go and go, no matter what, oh look, it's environment. Oh look, this is here, therefore environment. And it's very easy to dismiss nature then. So they both have their limitations. So this is how you could go about sort of trying to understand the strength of nurture and nature. But at the end of the day, because again they're so closely intertwined, you aren't going to be able to separate them. So here we go. This is the last sort of bit before we finish. This is your approaches to psychology. So you got to think, where do the different approaches fall along this spectrum that we have? So what one has the biggest focus on nature? I think you already know, it being the behavioral or the biological, the biological approach. Sorry, got confused. Biological approach absolutely has, it's all about genetics. So obviously then they're going to be the one that is most nature heavy. Then you have your psychoanalysis. Now Freud, as much as he does talk about the relationships between parents and children, he does say first and foremost it is nature. So your innate drives, and you have to go through these innate processes of psychostages of development, otherwise you yourself will be not as developed as a person. So he argues that it is biology or it is nature. Then humanism sort of sits in the middle, and it is again, it's probably the most balanced one. It's the one which just says, well, you've got to understand there is, people are machines, and as a result that they have the biological influence there, but at the same time they have the ability to make choices. So because of this and because of their understanding of free will, they're more in the middle and very balanced. Whereas then cognitive, is starting to get up to more of the nurture side. So there are some innate mental structures there, but these are changed very easily through the environment. And then behaviorist being the extreme nurture side, where everything is learned through the environment and through conditioning. So this brings us to what I want you to kind of do. Now, this is more of what you need to know, and you need to be confident in answering what the nature-nurture debate is. So you need to be able to say, well, what is it that what nativists would say, and what would behaviorists say, and why they disagree. You need to distinguish between the difference and use some examples. So I use the Bowlby one, where you can say, well, look, Bowlby said this, but it can also be explained through behavioral factors. And then this is probably the big one. You want to focus on, and this is probably the one which I'm going to get you to actually do. I want you to explain one approach. Look at one approach and go into a lot more depth than what I did. I skated over them very, like you saw, I gave them one sentence. How does one approach focus mainly on what and why? And then you have to evaluate the role of nature and nurture in explaining human behavior, which I believe is, no, it's not. Okay, so I was thinking it was a 16-mark question, but no. So these are the things which you need to be confident in doing. If you still need some help, there are some videos that I can link you to, or I'm more than happy to go ahead and try an alternate way of explaining. But there is the textbook as well, page 100 and 101, that you can go and have a look. Simply Psychology is there, as well as my email. But until now, this is where we will leave it. So thank you for watching. I'll try to get the next biopsychology video out later this week. Until then, I'll see you in the next video.